And when she parked the car, on her walk back, she was shot and killed.
We just got our first look at the 18-year-old who police say murdered a woman in the Heights and then stole her car before getting involved in a standoff with police.
The 18-year-old accused of shooting and killing a woman during a carjacking in the Heights is now facing federal charges. Right now, Darius Dwayne Hall is being held without bond on a capital murder charge, and he's
Late night in Houston, Texas. A quiet neighborhood in the Heights suddenly became the center of a police emergency. A woman had been shot. Moments later, officers realized something even more disturbing. The suspect had stolen a car and vanished into the city. Within the hour, Houston police would launch a high-speed chase across the city. But what investigators didn't yet know was that the victim they were trying to save had spent that entire day doing something incredibly selfless. She had come to Houston for one reason: to help a friend battling cancer. And the young man accused of killing her was already under supervision for violent crimes. At that moment, nobody realized they were witnessing the beginning of one of Houston's most disturbing recent cases. Before the violence, police lights, and headlines, there was a woman whose life was defined by kindness. Her name was Marietta Allison. She was 61 years old and lived in the city of Austin, a place where she had built a life centered around family, friendship, and adventure. Marietta was married and the mother of 2 adult children. Those who knew her say she was the type of person who rarely sat still for long. She loved to travel, not just for the destinations, but for the experiences and the people she met along the way. In fact, she had turned that passion into a career. Marietta was the co-founder of a travel company, helping organize trips and experiences for others who shared the same curiosity about the world. Friends often described her with the same 3 words: adventurous, generous, and always ready to help someone who needed it. She was the kind of person who showed up. If a friend was going through a difficult moment, Marietta would be there. If someone needed encouragement, Marietta was the one making the phone call. And sometimes she went even further. Earlier that year, Marietta had been traveling overseas, exploring the historic city of Istanbul. But when she learned that someone close to her was facing a frightening medical diagnosis, she didn't hesitate. She cut her trip short and flew home. That person was her close friend, Cassie Daniel. Cassie had recently been diagnosed with cancer and was preparing to undergo treatment at MD Anderson Cancer Center, one of the leading cancer hospitals in the United States. Cancer treatment can be exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Appointments can stretch for hours. Travel can be difficult. So Marietta offered to help. She volunteered to drive Cassie from Austin to Houston for treatments. She stayed with her during appointments, and she made sure her friend didn't have to face the journey alone. To Marietta, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was simply what friends do. But what nobody could have imagined was that this simple act of kindness would place her in the path of someone investigators already knew: an 18-year-old named Darius Dwayne Hall. March 2026. It had already been a long day for Marietta Allison and her close friend Cassie Daniel. Early that morning, the 2 women had traveled from Austin to Houston, a drive that takes nearly 3 hours. Their destination was the world-renowned MD Anderson Cancer Center. Cassie was undergoing cancer treatment there, and Marietta had offered to make the trip with her, driving, waiting, and staying by her side during the long hours of appointments. Hospital visits can be draining. Between consultations, tests, and treatments, the day stretched on longer than expected. By the time they finally left the medical center that evening, both women were exhausted. But there was also a sense of relief. The difficult part of the day was over. All that remained was getting back to the apartment where they were staying for the night. Shortly before 11 p.m., Marietta pulled into the quiet Houston neighborhood. Streetlights cast long shadows across the road as the car slowed near the apartment building. According to investigators, it was around 10:50 p.m. when they arrived. Cassie gathered her things from the passenger seat. After a full day at the hospital, she was ready to go inside and rest. She stepped out of the vehicle with her luggage and headed toward the apartment. Marietta stayed behind. She still needed to park the car. At first, it seemed simple, but parking in the neighborhood was limited that night. Cars lined both sides of the street. So Marietta began slowly circling the block, scanning the curb for an open space. It was the kind of small inconvenience most people barely think about. A quiet street, a routine moment, just someone looking for a place to park before calling it a night. But in the darkness of that Houston neighborhood, someone else was nearby, watching. Investigators would later say the person responsible had already been involved in violent crimes before, an 18-year-old named Darius Dwayne Hall, and within minutes, an ordinary night would turn into a crime scene. Just before midnight on a quiet street in the Heights neighborhood of Houston, after circling the block looking for a parking spot, Marietta Allison found an open space along West 20th Street. She pulled the car to the curb and turned off the engine. It was a routine moment, the kind most people never think twice about. But investigators say that as Marietta stepped out of the vehicle, something changed. A masked man suddenly approached. According to police, the suspect appeared to be attempting a robbery. Authorities believe he tried to take Marietta's purse, but Marietta resisted. What happened next unfolded in only seconds. During the struggle, the attacker pulled out a gun. A single shot rang out into the night. Marietta collapsed onto the sidewalk. The suspect quickly grabbed the car keys and got behind the wheel. Within moments, the vehicle sped away from the scene. Inside the nearby apartment, Marietta's friend, Cassie Daniel, heard the gunshot. At first, she wasn't sure what had happened, but when Marietta didn't return, Cassie tried calling her phone. There was no answer. Outside, neighbors had also heard the sound. Several of them began dialing 911. Within minutes, police officers and emergency responders arrived on West 20th Street. They found Marietta lying on the sidewalk with a gunshot wound. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but the injury was severe. Despite emergency treatment, Marietta Allison would not survive the night. Meanwhile, the person responsible was already fleeing across Houston in the stolen vehicle. Investigators would soon learn that the driver was an 18-year-old named Darius Dwayne Hall, and the search for him was already underway. Officers from the Houston Police Department quickly secured the area with crime scene tape, while paramedics rushed to help the victim. By that point, investigators already knew they were dealing with a homicide. But they also had something many early investigations don't: a lead. The suspect had fled the scene in the victim's car. That meant the vehicle itself could become the key to finding whoever was responsible. Police immediately issued an alert across the city with the vehicle's description and license plate number. Patrol units began scanning the streets. Meanwhile, detectives started interviewing witnesses who had been nearby when the gunshot was heard. Inside the apartment building, officers spoke with Marietta's friend, Cassie Daniel. Cassie told investigators that she had gone inside only moments before the attack. Then she heard the sound of a gunshot outside. When Marietta didn't come inside, Cassie tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. Outside, detectives carefully began documenting the scene. Investigators recovered several pieces of evidence that could help reconstruct what had happened. Among them were Marietta's purse, a shell casing believed to have come from the weapon used in the shooting, and statements from neighbors who had heard or seen parts of the incident. Each detail would later become part of the timeline investigators were building. But the most important clue that night didn't come from the sidewalk. It came from technology. Across Houston, law enforcement had access to a network of automated license plate readers, cameras positioned along roads and intersections designed to scan passing vehicles. Shortly after the shooting, that system detected the stolen vehicle moving through the city. Suddenly, the suspect wasn't just a description anymore. Police now had a direction. Less than an hour after the attack, officers spotted the vehicle. What happened next would turn a murder investigation into a citywide pursuit. But there was still a critical question. Who was behind the wheel? At that point, police could not rule out several possibilities. Was it the same person who had confronted Marietta on West 20th Street? Or could it have been someone else entirely? Someone who had stumbled upon the car after the crime and decided to take it. Investigators considered every possibility. But soon, events unfolding across the city would begin to narrow the answers. Using the alert sent out to patrol units, officers across Houston were watching closely for the stolen vehicle. Then, not long after the alert was issued, one patrol unit spotted a car matching the description. The officer attempted a routine traffic stop. Flashing lights, a signal for the driver to pull over. For a moment, it appeared as though the vehicle might slow down. But then the driver made a different decision. Instead of stopping, the vehicle accelerated. What followed was no longer a simple traffic stop. It became a pursuit. A high-speed chase began moving through Houston's streets. Police vehicles followed as the suspect sped away, weaving through traffic and ignoring commands to stop. In investigations like these, a suspect's reaction can reveal as much as physical evidence. And this decision told officers something important. The person behind the wheel wasn't just avoiding a ticket. They were running. And that strongly suggested one thing. The driver had something to hide. The chase continued through the streets of Houston, with multiple patrol units following the stolen vehicle. According to police, the pursuit stretched nearly 10 miles across the city. Officers maintained visual contact as the vehicle sped through traffic, refusing repeated commands to stop. Then suddenly, the chase came to a violent end. Near the Southwest Freeway, the stolen car crashed. But the driver wasn't finished running. He jumped out of the vehicle and took off on foot. Police officers quickly moved into the area, searching nearby streets and buildings. Within moments, the suspect forced his way into a nearby apartment unit. What had started as a robbery investigation had now escalated into a tense standoff. Police surrounded the apartment complex, while additional units arrived to secure the perimeter. Residents in the area were instructed to stay inside their homes as officers attempted to bring the situation under control. Members of a tactical team were called in. Negotiators began trying to contact the suspect inside the apartment. For hours, the situation remained uncertain. Officers worked carefully, knowing the suspect was believed to be armed. Eventually, police made the decision to move in. Inside the apartment, officers located the suspect hiding. He was taken into custody without further incident. Investigators soon identified the young man as Darius Dwayne Hall. He was just 18 years old. But as detectives began looking into his background, they discovered something troubling. This was not his first encounter with the criminal justice system, and that revelation would soon raise new questions about the events that led to Marietta Allison's death. When police finally took the suspect into custody after the hours-long standoff, investigators began the process of identifying exactly who they had arrested. The young man was identified as Darius Dwayne Hall. He was just 18 years old. At first glance, Hall appeared to be just another teenager, someone barely old enough to be considered an adult in the eyes of the law. But as detectives began examining court records and prior case files, a much more troubling picture started to emerge. According to investigators, Hall was already under juvenile court supervision at the time of the shooting that killed Marietta Allison. That meant he had already been involved in serious criminal cases before the night of the attack. Records revealed several previous allegations connected to violent crimes. Among them were accusations involving aggravated robbery, assault, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. One case in particular stood out. In 2024, Hall had been involved in an aggravated robbery case while he was still a juvenile. Court proceedings resulted in a 10-year sentence that was largely probated, meaning he remained under court supervision through the year 2027. In other words, when Marietta Allison was shot in Houston's Heights neighborhood, Hall was already under legal supervision from the justice system. That revelation raised difficult questions for investigators and prosecutors. How had someone already connected to violent crimes ended up back on the streets? And what exactly had he been doing in the hours leading up to the shooting? Detectives began carefully reconstructing the timeline of that night. They analyzed witness statements, they reviewed the pursuit, they examined evidence recovered from the stolen vehicle, and piece by piece, investigators began building a clearer picture of what had happened. Because the evidence was about to start stacking up. By the time detectives began assembling the full timeline of the night, the investigation had already produced several important leads. Now, the focus shifted to evidence. Investigators needed to determine exactly what had happened during the moments leading up to the shooting of Marietta Allison. The first major discoveries came from the vehicle the suspect had used to flee the scene. After the police pursuit ended and the suspect was taken into custody, officers conducted a detailed search of the stolen car. Inside the vehicle, investigators recovered multiple items that immediately raised serious concerns. Among them were 2 firearms. Officers also located ammunition inside the car, along with other materials that would later undergo forensic testing. Each item was carefully collected, photographed, and documented as part of the investigation. But physical evidence was only one part of the picture. Witness statements also began helping detectives understand what had happened earlier that night. According to reports, one young passenger who had been in the vehicle told investigators that the suspect, later identified as Darius Dwayne Hall, had been waving a firearm around earlier in the evening. That statement suggested the weapon may have already been in Hall's possession before the robbery occurred. Meanwhile, forensic teams focused on the shell casing recovered from the scene on West 20th Street. Ballistics experts would later analyze the casing to determine whether it matched one of the firearms recovered during the arrest. At the same time, detectives were reviewing digital evidence. Surveillance cameras in the area provided additional context about the movements of the stolen vehicle. Investigators also reviewed the data collected from Houston's network of automated license plate readers, which had helped officers track the vehicle as it moved across the city. Together, these systems allowed detectives to reconstruct the suspect's path after the shooting. The timeline showed the car leaving the scene, moving through Houston streets, and eventually leading officers into the pursuit that ended near the Southwest Freeway. Piece by piece, the evidence began to align. The physical evidence, the witness statements, the digital trail. Taken together, investigators said the findings pointed toward a single conclusion. According to police, Darius Dwayne Hall had confronted Marietta Allison during an attempted robbery, and when she resisted, he fired the shot that ended her life. Hall was charged with capital murder, a charge used in Texas when a killing occurs during the commission of another serious crime, such as robbery. Authorities also charged him with evading arrest following the police pursuit across Houston. And investigators added a third charge, tampering with evidence, related to actions police believe occurred during the attempt to flee and hide from officers. But the case would not remain limited to state charges. Because the crime involved a stolen vehicle and a firearm, federal authorities also began reviewing the case. Soon after, prosecutors added federal firearm and carjacking charges. As detectives continued questioning Hall, investigators say he acknowledged being involved in the robbery that night. However, according to reports, Hall denied intentionally shooting Marietta Allison. But by this stage of the investigation, police believed the evidence they had collected painted a different picture. The physical evidence recovered from the car, the witness statements, the forensic analysis, and the timeline created from surveillance and license plate reader data. Taken together, investigators said the findings pointed toward one conclusion: that during the attempted robbery on West 20th Street, Marietta Allison resisted, and in that moment, the situation turned deadly. As the investigation moved from the streets of Houston into the courtroom, the case began drawing attention far beyond Texas. At the center of that attention was the age of the suspect. Darius Dwayne Hall had only recently turned 18. Just months earlier, he would have still been considered a juvenile under the law. But because he was now legally an adult, the charges he faced carried some of the most serious penalties available in the Texas criminal justice system. Prosecutors charged Hall with capital murder in connection with the death of Marietta Allison. Under Texas law, capital murder can carry a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, and in some cases, it can make a defendant eligible for the death penalty. The case quickly became a topic of national discussion, not only because of the crime itself, but because of what investigators had learned about Hall's past. Court records showed that Hall had previously been involved in serious criminal allegations while still a juvenile. However, like many juvenile cases in the United States, much of that history had remained largely outside public view. As details of the case began appearing in news reports, some lawmakers and legal commentators began debating whether violent juvenile records should be more transparent. Supporters of stricter disclosure argued that communities and courts should have a clearer understanding of an offender's history when violent crimes are involved. Others warned that exposing juvenile records more broadly could undermine the goal of rehabilitation within the juvenile justice system. While that debate continued, prosecutors focused on what they believed the evidence had already shown. According to investigators, the motive behind the killing was tragically simple. They argued that the confrontation on West 20th Street began as an attempted robbery. But when Marietta Allison resisted, the situation escalated, and in a matter of seconds, what started as a robbery became a deadly crime.
In the days following the shooting, the impact of the tragedy spread far beyond the quiet street where it happened. For the family of Marietta Allison, the loss was devastating. Marietta had traveled from Austin to Houston for one simple reason. She wanted to support a close friend during cancer treatment. What was meant to be an act of kindness, a trip to help someone through one of the hardest moments of their life, ended in unimaginable tragedy. Meanwhile, the legal case against Darius Dwayne Hall continues to move through the courts. Prosecutors are seeking justice for Marietta Allison and her family. And even now, as the legal process continues, one haunting question remains. How could a simple act of kindness lead to such a tragic ending? If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, subscribe to True Crime Archive HQ, because every case has a story, and every victim deserves to be remembered.